Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, frequent flyers, wherever you're joining us today. On this episode of The Lounge, I have Erin Miller with me, and we are going to be talking about WASP, the Women Air Force service pilots who we believe are true heroes of the aviation industry. She is a woman with passion, drive, and serious spunk, and is an attorney, author, pilot, fluent in Italian, and an activist for women in aviation. Erin, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here with me today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Erin, you and I connected through LinkedIn, and you were a guest on a mutual friends of ours podcast as well, Forging Metal, if I'm not mistaken.
Medal of Honor podcast.
Medal of Honor. Okay, sorry. Yeah. And we got connected through our mutual love of women in aviation and also highlighting females in the military and aviation. And so, can you tell us a little bit about WASP and what that means to you and how that's impacted your life? I know your grandmother served, and so I'd love to hear your side of the story.
So my grandmother was one of the women Air Force service pilots during World War II. They're the WASP. And growing up, I knew what she did. She had a uniform. She went to events. She gave talks at schools and things, although she never came to my school somehow. I don't know how that happened. And so I just thought, everyone knew about them. Actually, when I was very small, I thought everyone's grandmother had been a WASP during World War II. So they were the first women to fly military planes for the United States Army. And I thought everyone's grandma, that was their job when they were younger.
Yeah.
And then when I got older, I realized, obviously, not everyone's grandma flew planes during World War II. And actually, not a lot of people even knew about them. And I only realized that as I got older. And, my grandmother shared it with us. It wasn't a secret or anything, but it's not like she forced us to go to things all the time or, all become pilots or anything like that. She was just very encouraging of whatever we wanted to do. And yeah, so, it was just kind of a given in my life. And she was a good role model. And she was, apart from being this strong woman during World War II, it did something very different that a lot of women were not doing.
Right.
She was just an interesting person and really funny and very feisty and supportive of whatever we wanted to do. And my cousin is in a band, and she would openly tell him, I don't like your music, but I support you. So
I love that.
Things like that. Yeah.
And what a great message, because very often, the people around us as we grow up, if they don't like what we're doing or they don't approve, they then try to, and move us in a different direction. So to just communicate, I may not like your music, but I support you chasing your dream, right? That's really powerful. Not everyone gets to grow up with that. So that's very cool. So your grandmother was a WASP. And so for those people who don't really know about WASP, can you tell us a little bit more? I mean, they were the first females to fly during World War II. They did a lot of aircraft deliveries, right? Bringing them across the Atlantic to support the war efforts. But what were some of the other things that you learned from your grandmother about this core of women that really supported our country during that time?
So the WASP actually did not fly overseas or leave the domestic United States. I think a lot of people get that confused. There was a British program called the ATA with women, and some of the women in the WASP went over there before all of this happened and were kind of flying with them or studying them. But the actual WASP program, when it began, went from 1942 to 1944, and it started with the Women's Flying Training Detachment and the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, which were run by Jackie Cochran and Nancy Love. And eventually the two programs merged in 1943 and became the WASP. And they were 1,102 women out of 18,000 applicants. Wow. Eventually 1,102 either graduated from the school or were merged in from the ferrying squadron, which were women who already were qualified before they started. And 38 of them died during World War II. They did not ever become commissioned officers. There was a bill in Congress to make them part of the Army, and it failed by 19 votes in the summer of 1944. So the program was eventually canceled without any benefits or recognition for these people.
Wow.
And they did a lot for women generally in aviation, but I mean, I think people look at them also as women's history, a step forward for women stepping outside of what is considered socially acceptable.
Right.
A lot of women then didn't even drive cars, but my grandma was flying airplanes for the Army, so that's unusual. And they did a lot of interesting things. Their tasks were, like you said, ferrying planes from factories where Rosie the Riveters were building them and taking them to departure points in various parts of the country. And then they would eventually be taken overseas. They were tow target pilots. So my grandmother's best friend during training was Maggie G, one of the 2 Chinese American women in the program. And they both got stationed at Las Vegas after training. And they had tow targets. They would tow these banners behind them like you see at the beach with like beer ads on them.
Yeah.
But guys would shoot at them to practice shooting down airplanes before they went overseas. They were trainers. My grandma trained men on instrument training in the BT-13 at Las Vegas. So they would cover the canopy and have instrument training, and my grandma, that was her job. And they also broke in engines, when the engines were repaired or they were new. They flew new planes back and forth to put hours on the engines.
Right.
They did all kinds of different jobs, but they stayed within the United States and they were not allowed to go into combat. So in that one way, they were restricted. But that's the basic history of the program.
Thank you for sharing that, and also for clarifying, because there is a lot of misinformation about that program versus, as you mentioned, the one with Britain, as well as, our good friend Jill Myers helped me correct the typo. I had WASPs with the S, even though it's already got pilots.
That's
right?
A big point of contention with my grandmother and her fellow pilots. They like to say WASP because the P in the acronym is plural.
Right.
But I have pointed that out several times to editors, and they say that is adding the S on the end. So WASPs is the way that they write it. So, I can't force it on them, but my grandmother would be very upset.
And we don't want that, right? It's kind of like when people say the ATM machine.
Yeah.
Right? It already stands for automatic
PIN
machine.
number.
Right.
The N is number. But
exactly.
Right.
So, I guess that's trying to change humankind, which is an endeavor that we will not be successful at.
But yeah, I'm also not a newspaper editor, so, that's right. If that's their style, then that's their style.
Absolutely. All right. So they were not approved in the 1940s to be commissioned officers and to be counted as part of the military, which is outrageous. They were actually training people going into combat in instrument flying, and they were doing all of this work. So you went on to take on Congress to pass a bill so that they could retrospectively be recognized and honored and be allowed to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery, which is, of course, only for service members. Can you tell us a little bit about, how you got started with that project and what inspired you to do that and what effort that took?
So to explain a little bit, since the program was disbanded in 1944 and they were not recognized at the time, in the 1970s, the services and the service academies began admitting women for pilot training or for entry into the service academies. So reporters and things started talking about, these are going to be the first women to fly military planes. And my grandmother and her friends were like, we did this 35 years ago. Maybe we should go remind people.
Right.
So they went to Congress and they lobbied and worked with several Congress members over several sessions of Congress to pass a bill to retroactively recognize their service as active duty. And eventually it was signed into law by President Carter in 1977. But it wasn't just granting them service. Then they had to go apply to the Department of Defense to request permission to be recognized. So the law just said, if you feel that you need recognition, you can go apply at DOD. So then they went to apply at DOD, which took another 2 years. So 35 years after my grandma served, she got her DD-214, which if you're watching and you don't know what that is, it's the paperwork that says you were an active duty service member. So it took her 35 years to get her paperwork. So fast forward into 2015 when my grandmother died. This whole time when I was growing up, like I said, she had a uniform. She went to these events. I never really thought much about it. And when she died, she left behind a letter saying she wanted to be buried at Arlington Cemetery. So my mom put in the paperwork, and about a month later, they called us and said she wasn't eligible because a month before my grandmother died, the Army had done a review of their regulations and stated that the WASP were not eligible to be in Arlington on their own merit. And my grandmother's husband, my grandfather, he died before I was born, so I never met him. He did not serve because he had a medical condition. So he's buried in a civilian cemetery. So a lot of the WASP in between had been buried with a spouse because a lot of them, for obvious reasons, married people in the service. So they were allowed to be there as a spouse. And some of them had funerals where they were buried as a spouse, and which meaning they got no funeral, service funeral. It's just a normal funeral. And so when my grandmother died and she wanted to be there on her own merit, it became a whole situation because the Army had just decided that they weren't allowed to be there.
Right.
So I did a bunch of research and realized that the law in 1977 stated that the law only applied to regulations under the Department of Veterans Affairs, and Arlington is run by the Department of the Army. Okay. Pretty much all the other national military cemeteries are run by the Department of Veterans Affairs. So they basically said she's a veteran in one part of the government, but not the other part of the government.
Okay.
Which, of course, is ridiculous.
Yes.
So in talking with my mom, I said, basically, you can get an exemption to have someone buried at Arlington, but we didn't want to do that because every time someone had this problem, they would have to file for an exemption, and she shouldn't really have an exemption. She should be properly recognized for her service.
Right.
So the other option was to get a law passed through Congress. So I started working on that, and it takes a lot of attention. So fortunately, I didn't really know exactly what I was doing, but I just kind of, went along and did things that seemed helpful. And then people started helping me. And then the more people help you, kind of just navigate your way through all of this. And eventually it worked out, fortunately.
And I think it's a wonderful kind of, not metaphor, but just a pathway to show we don't need to know how it's going to work out or have all the pieces in place before we start taking action, right? It was just this clarity of this is important. We're going to make this happen, and I'll figure it out along the way. And in doing so, you were able to recruit that help that you needed in order to make it happen.
It was very much like that. I'm an attorney, so obviously I have a very basic understanding of what is supposed to happen. But when you're actually in there doing it, talking to people, figuring out how to get all this done, working with the media, working with different people, collecting people for your team, I've never done any of that before. So kind of just winging it.
To be a true aviator, right? Maverick style. Yeah, and no, I think that's really beautiful because so many times we get stuck, right? And we think that, I need to have the whole team first, or I need to know exactly what to do in order to take action. And obviously that was a huge task. And you were just breaking it down, like, what is this piece in front of me? Let me get started with something. And then you started asking questions and being curious and engaging, right? And you recruited people to the cause. It wasn't just about getting something done. It was bigger than that. It wasn't just for your grandmother. It was for all of these women who served and were very instrumental during that time. And so everybody watching, if you have a big task ahead of you, breaking that down and just looking at that piece right in front of you is going to be how you can start to gain traction.
Exactly. It started out obviously for my grandmother, but then it became a bigger thing. And so, people are interested in them. And I'm really lucky that over the years, people are very inspired by their story and want to help. And, I watched over the years my grandma interact with people and kids, and people are very inspired by what they did, and they just like their story. So that helped a lot.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think that's, again, when we make it about the community, when we change the focus from me to we, that's very often what happens. And so whatever that project is, of course, it may start in a self view, but then once you can expand that and really connect, why is that important for other people? That's then giving them permission to also follow their dreams and make things happen that maybe they thought weren't possible. So I think that's another part of what you were doing, is giving people a pathway to say, just because someone else said it's over doesn't mean it's over.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's another way. It's a complicated way, but it exists.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sometimes, we all think that there's this like straight line path to success and we've got this map to go from, point A to point B. But very often, there's a road blockage. We take a detour because it looks pretty over there, right? Someone told us there's a great restaurant and, we could just fast track it on the Autobahn, if you will, or we can take the scenic route. And so sometimes that scenic route has extra challenges.
Right.
We can turn that into an adventure as well. So that's really amazing. Well done. And so now that passed and your grandmother was able to be buried at Arlington and so have all these other women. Is that correct?
Yes. So the bill was introduced in January of 2016 in Congress, and it was signed by the president on May 20th of the same year, which is pretty fast for things there, especially like individual things.
Yeah.
So a year and a half after she died and getting a law passed through Congress, we were able to have a funeral for her at Arlington National Cemetery. And one cute thing is in the letter she left behind, she said something like, "Don't make a big fuss out of this. You can just like serve sandwiches after my funeral." And meanwhile, it's like hundreds of people came. We had like 50 reporters there. It was on all kinds of news channels and it was a huge deal. And I think she would have found it really funny.
Yeah.
But what she really wanted and what all these women really wanted out of their service was to make sure that people remembered what they did and that they served their country in a time of need. And they weren't really looking for recognition for themselves, but just to make sure that people remember this part of history because, again, several decades later, these women were going through training and going through all the same problems again because we missed 35 years of building blocks, right? Because we had to start all over again.
Yeah.
So it's important to her and to all of them that they're remembered for what they did. And ironically, by getting to a fight with the cemetery, millions of people learned about them, which is what she really wanted in the first place.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, it definitely was necessary. So, well done for taking that through. And I'm glad that she put that as her request because, during that time, I talk a lot about Rosie the Riveter. And in that first year of World War II, women in aviation went from less than 1% to 63%, not just pilots, but the whole industry.
right.
And then a few years later, it was back down to just a few percent, right? And then we had, again, as you said, the problems and the cycle just continued the way that it was. And so we lost a lot of progress there, but that doesn't mean that we're not making progress, right? And so there's more to be done, yes, but we have to also celebrate these wins along the way and think about the women that are coming after, right? And so that's what my mother was thinking about is this needs to happen, not so I get recognition, but so that there's this pathway for other women who may serve.
Exactly.
Yeah, beautiful. All right. So when you were doing that, really taking a stand for something, and I mean, and as an attorney, you obviously will be doing that if you're in court, but just in your own personal life, how have you found that experience of taking a stand, going up to Congress to request this and make this thing happen? How has that been captured in your life and the things that you've created? I know you've written a couple of books. What was that experience? How did that translate into your day-to-day life?
So at the time I was working a full-time job and I started working on Saturdays because we had a system where if you worked on Saturday, you could take a day off in the middle of the week and switch days. So I would do that a lot and spend the whole day in the middle of the week walking around Capitol Hill and talking to people, talking to members of Congress. And I spent all my free time and even some vacation time doing this for several months. And I felt like it was really important. I actually enjoyed it, which sounds weird because most people probably think like going to Congress, that's
right.
It was actually fun. You meet all these people. And I mean, I had a situation where people were generally supportive. So they were happy to help. And so when people are happy, it's like everyone's happy to help and you're excited. And, it's still stressful because, things happen. And in my book, I talk about, there was a terrorist attack, there was a huge snowstorm, all these things happen and you feel like something could derail it at any moment. It's like very nerve-wracking. Kind of in 2020, nobody expected a pandemic to happen, right? Like if that had happened in the middle of this, I don't know if it would have been successful, So I was very stressed about like things derailing all of it and you just have to focus constantly on it. but I actually enjoyed it and was happy to do this for my grandmother. And I felt like I was helping her, like I said, complete her legacy and make sure people remembered them and she was properly honored. And I got to meet all kinds of people and get more involved in the aviation community. And I've written 2 books, a kid's book and a book about getting my grandma buried in Arlington and her life and my life with her growing up and the history of the WASP. And now I have kind of taken all of that. And I did not expect any of this to happen. You know, I wasn't a little kid like, I hope one day I can do it. I didn't think about this at all. It's just something that happened. I happened to be in the right place, in the right circumstances to help. And then since then, you know, people like you, they want to talk about it on podcasts and news stories and read my books and have me come talk to their schools. And it's great. And it's not something I expected to happen. I thought I would have her funeral and then it would be the end of that, but that was not the case. And I'm very happy to do it. It makes me happy to share her story. You know, I love when people write to me and they say how meaningful it is that, you know, they read my book or their child did a project on the WASP in school. There's a girl who dressed up like my grandmother for a school project. And I love getting those emails because I just think about how happy my grandma would be to learn about all these people that are learning about them. Because like I said, that's all she really wanted was for people to remember them. And so she would be so happy. And I know all the other WASP are happy. We have about 10 of them still alive. So there are very few left. So it's good that I have all these people trying to help me carry on their legacy, and it makes me happy.
Yeah, and how beautiful for those that are still here to be able to see what has taken place and know that they're inspiring this next generation of young girls and women in aviation and to be able to experience it before they pass on. You know, it's such a beautiful thing. And I think, you know, what you just said, you didn't set out to write a book and do all of these things. It just happened after. And it's because you were connected to this mission and vision that you had for the values that are important to your life, for the values your grandmother instilled in you and, you know, you experienced. And that was more important than just an outcome, right? And so that's a great way to look at anything we're doing in life, anything we're creating. It's not just about the outcome, the A, right? The big bonus at the end of the year or the new job promotion. It's about enjoying the life that you have and living your values rather than compromising them just to achieve something. So I think that's really powerful. And that's why it hits home for so many people.
Right. And naively, somehow, I've written these 2 books. We did this huge book launch at the Women's Memorial next to Arlington, which was great. And I did a book tour my first year and went to all these places and did book signings and did talks, and it was great. And I did not realize how many people would ask me about the process of writing a book. For some reason, that just went over my head. I was like, they're just going to ask about the WASP and my grandma. But no, so many kids and people in general just are like, you wrote a book? That's amazing. How do you do it? And ask all these questions. And so since then, I talk to people a lot about writing books and the process and one of the things I say is what you just said is like, when you are writing, are you writing something that's going to bring value to someone? Right. You know, like I said, when people read my book and they send me like notes saying this thing meant a lot to me, it helped me in my life, it resonated with me in such and such a way, it makes me feel like, okay, I did this thing and it has value to someone. You know, if you're just writing and you have no, you know, if you're going to bring value to someone, it's a success. You know, whether you sell bazillions of books or not that many, you're bringing value to the world, to, you know, with your story. I think that's a good point and it's successful.
Yeah, wonderful. I love that you highlight that because even if it just impacts one person, it's worth it, right?
Right.
So it's really aligning with, you know, why is this important to you? Is it for you or is it for someone else? Is it for both, right? Obviously, writing your own story can be very cathartic and therapeutic, and that's important. But then to also have it help others, delivering it in a way that can help inspire them to think differently, to feel differently, to take action on their dreams. And that's where the real power lies in sharing our story.
Absolutely.
Beautiful. So what would you say, Erin, is your superpower? I like to say the pivot is your superpower. And we all have these hidden abilities that we may not necessarily consider them, with this word, because we usually think of the Avengers or Spider-Man or something like that, right? So what would you say is your superpower?
I think one of them, I don't know if it's the only one, is it's kind of like thriving in chaos, or like this thing happens, right? I need to go to Congress. I think a lot of people would be thinking, this is crazy. I'm not doing that. But I was just like, it'll be fine. I'll figure it out.
Yeah.
There's all this chaos happening around me. And the same thing when emergencies happen, I just am like, okay, well, what do we need to do? What needs to be done? That's how I am. I'm like pretty calm. I think about all these things happening and you just figure out what has to be done.
Yeah, you're that calm in the chaos that helps other people. You're that lighthouse,
Yes.
right? That other people can go, okay, that's where we need to go. We've got someone to help guide us. So that's beautiful. And that's a very important superpower. Not everybody can do that. And so being able to, again, be of service in that way is really powerful. So who would you say, I always like to ask this question. We all have companies have a board of directors, right? But as a person, we have those key people that we go to and always ask for support or help, our mentors. And we might even have people in our own mind that, maybe, like, for example, your grandmother, you might look at life through her lens and think, what would she do in this situation? So I can already guess she's probably on your board of directors. But do you have any other key people that you regularly kind of check in with for the big decisions you make in your life and when you need a sounding board?
Yeah. So yes, my grandmother's voice is up here somewhere all the time. I spent a lot of time with her. She lived down the street from me when I was a kid. When I was sick and I couldn't go to school, I sometimes would stay at her house for the day, that type of thing. So she's kind of always floating around out here. And then my sisters I talk to a lot. And I have friends in aviation that I talk to, and friends from college. So these are kind of my three groups of people, I think.
Nice. And I like that you've identified that they're different groups, because I think sometimes we tend to think, oh, just the mentors in the professional space, but we forget about those influential people and people we lean on in our personal lives. And, each one impacts the other. We're not silos. We're multifaceted
Right.
in our interests, and the people you've known since college, they'll know a different version of Erin than only the people that met you later in life or in the workspace, right? And
Exactly.
So it's really important to get those perspectives.
Right.
Yeah, beautiful. All right, so my final question I always love to ask my guests is, how do you best serve or represent humanity? And the reason for this question is kind of, there's a lot going on in the space realm right now, and we're exploring, going out, and if we were to meet an alien, if they were to arrive here or we were to go somewhere else, what would you be representing for humanity, and how do you best serve us?
This is such a dramatic question, but
I know. That's why I like to ask it, because it forces a pause.
So I think some kind of connection with history is how I would answer that. Connecting. I have a friend, one of my people in aviation, she says I'm the connector. I always meet people and I'm like, oh, you should meet this other person because you guys both do X.
Yes.
So I connect people, I connect history. That's kind of my thing, is fitting people together and fitting my grandma's story and the WASP together with what's going on today and helping people connect all of these dots. And I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but that's my answer.
Absolutely. It totally is. I love to see what people come up with, because we all have unique abilities and skill sets, and we all represent different things, right? So it's important to have artists, to have connectors, to be connected to history, right? We have to remember where we came from in order to progress into where we want to go. So really powerful. Thank you so much, Erin, for being here with me today. It was
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, it was our pleasure. And so for everyone watching, you can rewatch this if you missed the live. It'll be posted to both Erin and my's LinkedIn. It's on my YouTube channel, as well as Facebook. So come and find us. Ask any questions that you might have in the comments. We'll do our best to get back to you. And for anyone who would also like to hear some more military veteran stories, the Medal of Honor podcast, I'll put a link to that in the comments as well. Thank you, Erin. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Okay, now we're saying bye.